The coach wheels ground into the frost-hard gravel of the inn-yard, and Grace Meredith stood very still and watched them turn. Dawn had barely broken over Farley Cross, mist low along the hedgerows, and inside the carriage, neither her aunt nor her cousin Selina glanced back, not one curtain twitching aside to find her standing there, her small trunk already loaded onto a stranger's cart by mistake the night before. The coachman had been told. She understood that now, watching the wheels turn onto the London road without her. This was not forgetting, this was arithmetic, and she was the sum they meant to be rid of. She had heard it only by accident, through the thin wall of the inn's best bedchamber the night before, her aunt's voice pitched low and flat as a ledger being balanced. "Leave her," Lady Fenwick had said, "and let the morning sort what she has cost us." Selina had laughed, a small, satisfied sound, the sound of a girl who had watched a duke ask a plain cousin to dance and could not forgive the room for noticing. Grace had lain rigid in the dark, the thin coverlet pulled to her chin, and told herself she had misheard. She had not misheard. By mid-morning, the innkeeper's wife, a broad, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Bexley, found her still standing in the yard and drew her inside, settling her near the kitchen fire. "Your room is paid through tonight only, ma'am," Mrs. Bexley said gently, "and no farther, and there is a gentleman just arrived asking after a Miss Meredith by name, though I told him nothing." Grace's hands had gone cold around the cup she was given. She knew only one man who might trouble himself to learn her name and follow her onto the road. Viscount Pembrey had never once been kind to her for no reason. 40 miles south, in a library too large for the single candle burning in it, Julian Marchmont, Duke of Alderley, broke the seal on a letter delivered by a rider so mud-spattered he had refused to sit. He read it once standing, and then again, and something in his face went very quiet and very still, the particular stillness his household had learned to fear. He did not ring for his steward, he did not send for his fastest man. He crossed to the window, looked once at the black, rain-driven night beyond the glass, and called for his own horse to be saddled. Grace had never in her 22 years been anywhere so thoroughly alone as she was in that inn-yard, and she made herself catalogue the fact the way she catalogued everything that frightened her, plainly, without flourish, the way she labeled the botanical drawings that were the only thing she had ever done well. Item, 4 shillings and a clipped 6pence in her reticule. Item, no trunk, no maid, no letter of introduction to anyone within 30 miles who did not already despise her. Item, a green cloth sketchbook, still hidden beneath her cloak where she had sewn a pocket for it herself 2 winters ago, because a girl with nothing else worth stealing learns to hide the one thing that is. She pressed her ink-stained fingers flat against the cover through the wool and made herself breathe. A church bell beyond the hedge struck the half-hour, ordinary and indifferent to all it had just cost her. Weeping would not summon the carriage back. Weeping had never once in her whole recollection summoned anything back. What she needed was a plan, and Mrs. Bexley's kitchen fire, and time enough to decide whether 4 shillings could carry her to any door in England that would open for a Meredith with no family behind her name to vouch for its worth. Mrs. Bexley did not ask what the girl had done to be left, which Grace was grateful for, because she did not know how to answer a question that assumed she had done anything at all. Instead, the innkeeper's wife set a second log on the fire and told her, in the brisk voice of a woman who had run the Kestrel and Crown for 30 years, that the sky over the North Road had the particular yellow-gray look that meant weather, real weather, coming down off the fells by nightfall, and that no coach fit to travel would be setting out again until it passed. "You'll bide here a night more whether your aunt willed it or not," Mrs. Bexley said, "and that will cost you nothing but the peeling of potatoes, if your pride can bear it." Grace's pride, she discovered, could bear a great deal more than she had ever asked of it before that morning. She peeled potatoes at the kitchen table until her hands ached in a new and honest way, and did not let herself think, not yet, about what waited for her at the end of the storm, or who had already begun asking for her by name in the taproom. She saw him before he saw her, through the gap in the kitchen door, and recognized the wine-red coat before she recognized the florid, self-satisfied face above it. Viscount Pembrey had the look of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his comfort, thinning hair combed forward, a signet ring he turned constantly on a soft finger, and he was asking the taproom boy, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether a young lady traveling alone had come through that morning, a Miss Meredith, dark-haired, no great beauty but tolerable enough, connected to the Fenwicks of Cross Hall. The stable boy shrugged and claimed he had seen no such lady, though his glance flicked once toward the kitchen passage before he caught himself, and Pembry's slow, satisfied smile told her the mistake had already been made. Grace's stomach folded in on itself. He had not stumbled upon her by accident on the London road. He had known where to look before he left home, which meant someone had told him precisely where she would be standing, defenseless, the very morning her family meant to abandon her there. Not an accident. Not even, she understood now with a coldness that went deeper than the room's chill. Entirely Selina's doing alone. She did not go out to him. She stood instead in the flour-dusted dark of the pantry with her back against a shelf of crockery and listened to him settle himself at the best table, calling for wine, for a room, for someone to see that his horses were stabled through the storm, speaking of the Fenwicks with a familiarity that turned her blood to ice water. There had been an arrangement, she gathered from the careless, wine-loosened fragments that reached her, something concerning a debt of her uncle's and a convenient young woman nobody would miss enough to ask questions about. She pressed her sketchbook tighter beneath her cloak, the one solid thing in a day that had rearranged the whole shape of her life since dawn. Somewhere above her she could hear Mrs. Bexley's footsteps crossing the passage twice, unhurried on purpose, buying whatever minutes a slow tread could buy. Outside, the wind was rising off the fells exactly as Mrs. Bexley had promised, rattling the shutters. And then, over that rattle, she heard Mrs. Bexley's voice pitched too bright and too careful in the passage outside the pantry door, agreeing to fetch Miss Meredith at once, sir, straight away, and Grace understood that hiding was no longer a plan she was permitted to keep. Mrs. Bexley walked her out with a hand at the small of her back, firm as a gate latch, and stayed exactly one pace behind her shoulder the whole while, which was, Grace understood, itself a kind of shield. Pembry rose when she entered, made her a bow a fraction too deep to be respectful, and said what a fortunate chance it was, finding her here of all places, as though the whole of England were not smaller than he pretended, and the coaching inns along the Great North Road fewer still. Your aunt mentioned you might winter with cousins near Thirsk, he said, watching her over the rim of his glass, and I thought, having business that way myself, I might see you safely delivered. He had the unhurried manner of a man who had never once been refused anything he wanted badly enough, and he did not trouble to lower his voice, as though the room full of witnesses mattered to him not at all. Grace kept her chin level and said nothing more than courtesy required, refusing to let him see her afraid. There was nothing in the words a magistrate could fault. There was everything in the smile beneath them that told her precisely what safely delivered was meant to cost. I thank you, my lord, but I am promised elsewhere, Grace said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she had any right to expect it to. Mrs. Bexley, without so much as a glance at her, chose that exact moment to announce that the good room above the stair was let already to a party expected before dark, and that Miss Meredith, being alone and unchaperoned, could not in conscience be permitted to take supper with any gentleman not kin to her, storm or no storm, and that was simply how the Kestrel and Crown had always been run. Pembry's smile thinned by a fraction, the first crack Grace had seen in it, and he said lightly that he supposed proprieties mattered even at wayside inns, and that he was a patient man, and that patience, in his experience, was always eventually rewarded. He did not say by whom or by what means, and the not saying was its own small violence. Grace watched the exchange with her hands clasped tight in her lap, grateful beyond words for a stranger's stubbornness, and understood that Mrs. Bexley had just spent some of her own, standing on behalf of a girl she had known less than a day. She retreated to the small parlor Mrs. Bexley gave her and let herself, for the first time all that endless day, think of the assembly at Alderley 3 weeks past, because it was easier than thinking of Pembry's smile. The sets had come up uneven that night, one lady short, and rather than let a gentleman stand out, the Duke of Alderley himself, cold and unapproachable by every account she had ever heard of him, had crossed the whole length of the room and asked her, a poor relation nobody troubled to introduce properly, to dance. She had dropped, in her fluster, the loose page from her sketchbook she had been using to press a dog rose flat, and he had bent and retrieved it before a footman could, studying the small, precise drawing for a moment too long before he handed it back and asked, quite seriously, whether she had drawn it herself. Selina had watched the whole exchange from across the room with an expression Grace had not understood then and understood perfectly now. It had been envy, plain and unmistakable, the envy of a woman who had spent a whole season angling for attention a shy cousin received without asking, and everything since had grown from that single dance like a weed from one careless seed. By the time full dark came down over Farley Cross, the storm Mrs. Bexley had promised arrived in earnest. Rain driving sideways against the taproom windows hard enough to rattle the old glass in its frame, and every traveler on the North Road who had not already reached shelter crowded into the Kestrel and Crown to wait it out, Pembry among them, settled now with a bottle he showed no sign of finishing quickly. There would be no coach out tonight for anyone, not for her, not away from him. Grace climbed the narrow servant's stair to the small attic room Mrs. Bexley had found for her, bolted the door with a bolt she tested twice, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her sketchbook open on her knees, not drawing, only holding it. The candle guttered low, throwing her shadow huge across the sloped ceiling, and she found herself opening the sketchbook after all, tracing one fingertip along a pressed leaf gathered that spring, a small, steadying ritual that asked nothing of the night beyond her. While below her the storm and the voices and Pembry's patient, waiting laughter went on into a night that had, until that morning, belonged entirely to someone else's plan for her. The letter that had emptied the color from the Duke of Alderley's face had come not from any Fenwick, but from his own sister, Lady Imogen, who had struck up, against every rule of what their mother would have called suitable acquaintance, a quiet friendship with the plain, clever cousin who drew flowers with a precision that put the professional botanical illustrators to shame. Imogen had met her only twice, once at that same assembly and once by chance in a Bath circulating library, and had come away both times with the distinct impression that Grace Meredith was worth more attention than her own family troubled to give her, an impression she had never once shared with her brother until this letter forced her hand. Imogen had written to her twice since the assembly, and had received, that very afternoon, a hurried, blotted reply sent from a coaching inn at Farley Cross, warning that she was to be left behind by her family and asking only that someone know where she had gone, in case. Julian, Imogen had written beneath it in her own hand, "You must do something, and you must do it tonight, because I do not think that girl believes anyone will." She trusted him to understand what she could not fully say. He had read the letter twice before he understood he was already reaching for the drawer where he kept, folded inside the cover of a ledger no one else ever opened, the small pressed dog rose page a poor relation had dropped at his own assembly 3 weeks before. He had told himself, retrieving it that night, that he meant only to have it returned to her properly, through the correct channels, at the correct time. He had not returned it. He had, if he was honest with the cold, exacting part of himself that ran his estates and rarely let him be anything else, looked at it more evenings than he cared to count, at the sureness of the lines, at what it meant that a woman treated as furniture by her own family drew the world with such careful, undefended tenderness. It was not, he told himself, even as he reached for it, the act of a disinterested man, and for once in his carefully governed life he did not trouble to argue himself out of the observation. The rain had already begun against the windows by then, though he had not yet noticed it. He put the page in his breast pocket, over his heart, without deciding to, and called again, louder this time, for his horse. His steward Hodge, a sensible man who had served 2 Dukes of Alderley and buried neither of his own opinions easily, said what any sensible man would say, that his Grace ought to send 4 riders and stay by his own fire, that a duke did not go galloping through a storm after a young woman unrelated to him by blood or betrothal, that it would be remarked upon, that it would be misread, that it would very possibly do the lady more harm in the telling than Pembry could do her in the doing. Julian listened to every word of it, standing already in his greatcoat, and said only that he had sent 4 riders once before, years ago, for someone else left alone at a coaching inn in weather very like this, and that they had arrived 4 hours too late to matter. Hodge tried once more, reminding him of the mud and the dark, and the very real chance of a fall, and Julian only pulled on his second glove, and said he had already decided before Hodge opened his mouth the first time. The horse, he added, would not saddle itself while they debated the matter further. He did not explain further. Hodge, watching his master's face, did not ask him to. He rode out alone, against every counsel his household could offer him, because the one lesson his life had taught him with any real cruelty was that other people's men, however loyal, however fast, arrived exactly as late as men who had not spent every mile of the ride imagining what they would find. The rain found the gap between his collar and his neck within the first quarter hour, and did not let him forget it again. Alderley Park fell away behind him, its windows lit and warm, and entirely wrong for a night like this one, and ahead of him lay 40 miles of black, flooding road to a coaching inn he had never once visited and now could not stop picturing, a girl with ink-stained fingers inside it, and a man whose reputation for patience he had heard enough of, in passing, in clubs, to trust not at all. He thought grimly that Hodge was not wrong about the danger of it and rode on anyway, because being right about the danger had never once, in his experience, made the danger worth avoiding when the alternative was arriving too late again. He put his heels to the horse and did not slow again for a long time. Below her, through the attic floorboards, Grace could hear the shape of the evening changing without being able to make out the words of it. Pembry's voice rising by degrees as the bottle emptied. Mrs. Bexley's answering him each time in the same brisk, unbothered tone a woman uses to manage a difficult customer she has managed 100 times before. Though Grace suspected privately that Mrs. Bexley had never before had to manage quite this particular kind of difficulty. Once she heard her own name, spoken too loudly to have been meant kindly, and once she heard Mrs. Bexley's voice go suddenly, unmistakably hard, the sound of a woman drawing a line and daring a paying guest to cross it. She thought once of calling down to ask what was happening, and decided against it, reasoning that whatever answer she received through a locked door and 2 floors of old timber would tell her less than her own ears already had, and would only announce, to anyone listening, exactly where she was hiding. She sat very still on the narrow bed, sketchbook clutched shut against her chest, and did the only arithmetic left to her: how many hours until first light, and whether a bolted door and one determined innkeeper's wife would hold that long. She understood, with the clear, unsentimental precision she brought to every drawing she had ever made, that her reputation was very likely already beyond saving, that a woman who had spent one night alone at a coaching inn, whatever did or did not happen inside its walls, would find very few doors in polite society still willing to open for her by morning. That understanding did not frighten her the way she had expected it to. It steadied her, oddly, the way finishing a difficult sketch always steadied her, because if the outcome was already half decided regardless of what she did next, then what she did next could at least be decided by her and no one else. She thought of her mother, briefly, who had faced worse than a locked door with far less to defend herself with, and found the memory less a comfort than an instruction. Dignity, once kept hold of, was difficult for anyone else to take. She dragged the room's one heavy chair in front of the bolted door, took up the small iron poker from the cold grate, and sat back down to wait, sketchbook in one hand, poker across her knees, prepared to be exactly as much trouble as anyone required her to be. The creak came a little after midnight, a single deliberate footstep on the attic stair that did not belong to Mrs. Bexley's familiar tread, followed by a long pause, and then the soft, testing pressure of a hand against her door, the latch rattling once against the bolt she had checked twice already. Grace did not call out. She rose instead, poker in hand, and stood facing the door in the dark, her heart going hard and fast, but her breath, she was almost proud to notice, staying level. Whoever stood on the other side did not speak either, only tried the latch a second time, more slowly, as though patience alone might convince a bolt to give way it had not been built to give. She counted her own heartbeats to keep from counting anything worse. 1, 2, 3. The way she had once taught herself to sit still for long enough to finish a difficult drawing, and found the old discipline useful now for reasons she had never once imagined when she first learned it. She thought of the dog rose page in her sketchbook, of the one dance in her whole life anyone had crossed a room for her sake, and found, absurdly, that the memory of it made her stand straighter rather than smaller. The footsteps withdrew after what felt like a very long minute, unhurried, entirely unashamed, back down the narrow stair to whatever conversation waited below, and Grace lowered the poker with a hand that shook now that there was no longer anyone to see it shake. She understood 2 things with equal certainty in the silence that followed. The first was that Pembry, or whoever had tested her door, would try again before morning, emboldened by however Mrs. Bexley's watch had thinned as the night wore on. The second was that no one in that inn, however kind, was going to be able to stand between her and the rest of that storm-locked night indefinitely. She did not sleep after that, though she lay back against the pillow with her eyes closed for form's sake, listening instead to every shift of the wind and every groan of old timber, cataloging each sound the way she cataloged everything, until even that grew too tiring to sustain. Outside, the rain had not eased at all, still hammering the small attic window in long, unbroken sheets, and somewhere beyond it, on a black flooded road she could not see and did not yet know existed, a man she had danced with exactly once was riding straight into the worst of it. The road north of Thirsk had gone half to river by the time Julian reached it, the ditches overflowing across the packed earth in black sheets that made every stride a wager, and twice his horse stumbled badly enough that he felt the animal's whole weight shift beneath him before it caught itself again. He did not slow. He had ridden this kind of weather before, though not often, and never with this particular pressure behind his ribs, a pressure that had nothing to do with the cold rain working its way through wool and leather, and everything to do with an arithmetic of his own that he refused to complete aloud. How many hours since the letter? 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 He thought once of turning back, of waiting out the worst of the storm at some lesser inn along the way, and dismissed the thought within the same breath that produced it, because waiting had never once, in his experience, made a bad night shorter for the person enduring it alone. He put his heels to the horse again and felt it answer him, gamely, gasping, through mud that dragged at every hoof like a hand trying to hold them both still. He let himself think of Anne then, because the storm had already dragged her halfway to the surface of his mind, and there seemed little use pretending otherwise. His cousin, his ward in all but law after her own father died, 17 and trusting and left, exactly as Grace Meredith had been left, at a coaching inn by a fiancé who had discovered a wealthier prospect and simply not troubled to come back for her. Julian had been told a week later, had sent 4 riders the moment he heard, had told himself that was surely swift enough, and had learned when they returned that Anne had already taken a chill in that unheated room waiting for a family that never came, a chill that became a fever inside a month, a fever no physician's skill had been able to turn back. He had never told anyone the whole of it, not even Imogen, and found it strange that the telling, even silent and only to himself, loosened something in his chest that 4 years of careful composure had not managed to loosen at all. He had buried her in the Alderley churchyard in the coldest February he could remember, and had not, since that day, allowed himself to trust any rescue he had not ridden out to deliver himself. That was the whole of it, the thing Hodge had not asked him to explain and he had not offered to, the reason a duke known across 3 counties for his icy composure was currently soaked through to the skin on a flooding road at 2 in the morning, rather than warm and dry, and trusting 4 capable men to manage what he could manage himself. He would not send anyone else's men for Grace Meredith. He would not learn, a week from now, that he had been 4 hours too late a second time in his life. Not for a woman who drew dog roses with that much unguarded care. Not for a woman whose family had looked straight through her the same way Anne's had, as though kindness were a debt they had already decided not to pay. He allowed himself, for the length of one breath, to imagine arriving too late a second time, and found the imagining so unbearable that he put his heels to the horse again before he had fully finished having it. He crested the last rise before Farley Cross with his hands numb on the reins and his coat plastered flat against him, and there, finally, through the driving rain, he saw lit windows. The kestrel and crown sat low and lantern-lit at the bottom of the hill, smoke tearing sideways from its chimneys in the wind, ordinary and warm-looking in a way that told him nothing at all about what was happening inside it. He was still a quarter-mile off, urging the last exhausted effort out of a horse that had earned better treatment than this by morning, when a crack of thunder rolled directly overhead, loud enough to swallow every other sound on the road for one long instant, and in the ragged silence just after it, he could have sworn he heard a woman's voice cry out from somewhere inside those lantern-lit walls. He slowed only enough to keep the horse from breaking a leg on the last treacherous stretch of track, every muscle in him straining toward the sound as though will alone could carry him faster than the animal beneath him. He had heard screams before, in worse circumstances than this, and had learned that the ones that mattered were always shorter than a man wanted them to be, swallowed too quickly by whatever had caused them, and he found himself praying, in a language he had not used since Anne's funeral, that this one would prove nothing at all. Downstairs the evening had curdled exactly as Grace feared it would. Pembry's patience finally exhausted by the bottle and by Mrs. Bexley's increasingly thin excuses, until he rose from his chair with the deliberate, over-careful balance of a very drunk man, determined to appear otherwise, and announced, to the whole taproom, that he would see Miss Meredith himself, since her hostess seemed unable to produce her by ordinary means. Mrs. Bexley planted herself bodily in front of the stair, apron still floured from the evening's work, and told him in a voice gone flat and dangerous that no gentleman climbed to a lady's private room under her roof uninvited, storm or no storm, title or no title, and that he would sit back down or she would send her own husband and the ostler to help him do it. Mrs. Bexley's husband, roused from the cellar by the commotion, arrived a moment too late to help, wiping his hands on his apron and taking in the scene with the slow dawning alarm of a man realizing the evening had gone somewhere he had not prepared for, while the ostler, younger and quicker, was already moving toward the stair himself. Pembry laughed, an ugly, wine-thick sound, and stepped around her anyway. Grace heard it through the floor, the raised voices, a scrape of furniture, Mrs. Bexley's shout cut short, and understood before the footsteps even reached the attic stair that whatever thin defense the evening had offered her was failing all at once. She stood, poker in hand, chair still wedged beneath the latch, and listened to the unsteady, heavier tread climb toward her, no longer testing, no longer patient, a fist coming down hard against the door itself now. Pembry's voice slurred and wheedling through the wood, telling her to be sensible, telling her no one would think the worse of her for opening it, telling her things a man only says when he has already decided the answer does not matter to him. She thought, with a strange detached clarity, that she had never once imagined her own courage would be tested inside four walls this small, over the sound of a fist against wood rather than any grander danger, and found that the smallness of the room made her resolve feel larger by comparison, not less, as though there were simply nowhere left in it for fear to hide. The chair held, the bolt held. Her own hands, she noticed distantly, did not shake at all this time. The door shuddered on its hinges under a shoulder thrown against it, once, twice, the old wood groaning in a way that told her the bolt, however sound, had not been built to withstand a man Pembry's size determined to have his way through it. "I will scream this whole inn awake, my lord," Grace called through the door, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, "and every soul in it will know precisely why, and precisely whose name to carry to London by morning." It bought her perhaps a minute, no more, Pembry's laughter turning uncertain, calculating, weighing a scandal against his own comfort. She pressed her back harder against the wall and did not lower the poker, though her arm had begun to ache with the effort of holding it steady, because she had decided, somewhere in the last unbearable hour, that whatever happened next would not happen to a woman who had simply stood still and waited for it. And in that minute she heard, unmistakably now, new voices rising from the taproom below, urgent, overlapping, and a sound she could not immediately place, hooves perhaps, or the front door of the inn thrown open hard enough to bang against the wall. Pembry heard it too, his weight shifting away from the door for one crucial instant, and Grace pressed her ear to the wood and listened to the confused, rising commotion below. Boots on the taproom floor. Mrs. Bexley's voice pitched suddenly high with something that was not fear. A man's voice she did not recognize, cutting through all of it. Low and cold and entirely unhurried in a way that somehow silenced the room faster than any shout could have. She had time to think, absurdly, of the dog rose page still folded inside her sketchbook, of the one evening in her whole life a room had turned to look at her for a reason that was not pity, and to wonder whether she would live to draw another flower at all before the footsteps reached the top of the stair. Footsteps started up the attic stair a second time, heavier now, more than one set, and Grace stood with her poker still raised and her back against the wall beside the door, unable to tell, in the space of 3 racing heartbeats, whether what climbed toward her now was rescue or simply reinforcement for the danger already trying to get in. It was the Duke of Alderley who reached the top of the stair first, rain still running from the hem of his greatcoat onto the worn floorboards, his face a controlled, terrible calm that made even Pembry, swaying uncertainly in the narrow hallway, take an involuntary step backward. Julian did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that raising it only gave lesser men something to raise their own voices against in return. He said only, quite quietly, that he understood Lord Pembry had mistaken this inn for one where the guests could be helped through their doors uninvited, and that he was here now to correct that misunderstanding personally, and that Pembry might choose, in the next 10 seconds, whether he preferred to leave under his own power or under someone else's. Behind him, Mrs. Bexley and her husband and the ostler crowded the narrow passage, and not one of them moved to intervene, because it was already plain, from the set of the Duke's shoulders and the particular stillness in his face, that this was not a matter requiring their assistance any longer, only their witness. Pembry opened his mouth once, as though to argue his rank against the Duke's, and shut it again without a word. Grace drew back the chair and the bolt with hands that were shaking now, finally, now that the danger had a shape she could set the poker down for, and opened the door to find the Duke of Alderley standing in the low attic passage, soaked through, breathing hard, looking at her with an expression she had never once seen on him across a crowded ballroom, and would not, she suspected, ever quite have words for afterward. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the rain still dripping steadily from the hem of his coat onto the worn boards between them, and Grace found she could not, in that first crowded instant, decide whether to laugh or weep or simply stand there, memorizing the particular exhausted relief on his face. "You came yourself," she said, because it was the only thing in her whole crowded racing mind that would form itself into words. "I sent no one else," he said, which was not quite an answer, and was somehow the whole of one. Behind him, somewhere down the stair, she could hear Mrs. Bexley already ordering dry towels and hot tea, practical even now, and the ordinary sound of it was what finally convinced her the danger had passed. Downstairs, in front of the innkeeper, the ostler, and every traveler the storm had trapped beneath that roof, the Duke of Alderley said, in a voice pitched now precisely to carry as far as it needed to, that Miss Meredith was under his family's particular protection, that any further inquiry after her welfare or her whereabouts might be addressed to him directly at Alderley Park, and that he trusted the matter, whatever Lord Pembry believed it to have been, was now entirely closed. It was, Grace understood even through her own relief, a claim that cost him something real, a duke's name spoken aloud at midnight in a country taproom on behalf of an unmarried woman he had danced with exactly once, the kind of talk that would reach London faster than any coach could carry it, and he had made it anyway, without once glancing toward her for permission first. No one in the room mistook the significance of it, least of all Lady Fenwick's absent ears, which would have the whole account relayed to them by morning, whether Julian intended it kindly or not, and he knew that too, and said it anyway, because some costs, he had decided somewhere on the flooded road behind him, were simply worth paying outright. Pembry, sobering by degrees under the weight of a duke's unblinking attention, gathered what remained of his dignity and his coat and made for the door, but he paused on the threshold long enough to say, with the particular spite of a man who knows he has already lost, that London loved nothing better than a story, and that this one, a duke and a penniless cousin and a midnight ride through a storm, would make a very good one indeed by the time it had passed through enough drawing rooms, however either of them chose to tell it now. Julian did not trouble to answer him, watching instead until the carriage lamps had shrunk to 2 small points and vanished around the bend toward the London road, and only then did the tight, controlled line of his shoulders finally ease by some small degree, as though he had been braced for a blow that had, in the end, only grazed him. Grace, standing beside him in the doorway, felt the same tension leave her own body in a long, unsteady breath she had not realized she was holding. The threat, Grace understood, watching his carriage lights vanish into the rain, had not left with him. Mrs. Bexley found them both a place by the kitchen fire once the taproom had emptied and the storm had begun, at last to soften into ordinary rain, and left a pot of tea between them with the particular tact of a woman who understood exactly how much privacy 2 people had just earned. Julian sat with his greatcoat steaming faintly and said nothing for a long moment, watching Grace's hands wrap around her cup, ink-stained fingers pale from cold and reaction both. "I ought to have come sooner," he said finally. "You came at all," Grace answered, "which is more than my own family managed," and something in his face, at that, went briefly and entirely undefended in a way she suspected very few people were ever permitted to see. Neither of them spoke for a while after that, content, or nearly so, to simply sit within the ordinary warmth of a kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke and had, for one long night, held the whole of both their lives inside it, and Grace found she did not mind the silence at all, only noticed, distantly, that it was the first entirely peaceful quiet she had known since the wheels of her aunt's carriage turned away from her at dawn. He reached inside his coat then and drew out a small folded page, water-spotted at one corner despite his best efforts to shield it, and set it on the table between them without quite meeting her eyes. "I kept it," he said, meaning the dog rose she had dropped and he had retrieved at the assembly 3 weeks before, and I told myself for 3 weeks that I meant only to return it properly, through the correct channels, and I did not, and tonight, writing here, I understood I had been lying to myself the entire time. Grace looked at the small, precise drawing, hers, unmistakably hers, carried folded over a duke's heart through 40 miles of storm, and found she could not, for once in her life, catalog exactly what she felt about it. She remembered, with sudden clarity, exactly how it had felt to drop it that night at the assembly, the small mortification of it, and how little she had expected, watching a duke bend to retrieve a stranger's dropped drawing, that the moment would prove to be the quiet hinge on which the whole of her life afterward would turn. 40 miles of storm, and a locked attic door, and all of it beginning with one careless page falling from her hands onto a ballroom floor. He told her about Anne then, briefly, plainly, the way a man tells a story he has never once told anyone by choice. A cousin left at an inn much like this one, 4 riders sent instead of himself, 4 hours too late to matter. I promised myself I would not make that mistake a second time, he said, and did not need to finish the thought aloud for her to understand precisely what he meant by it, that writing out himself had never really been about propriety, or its absence at all, but about a debt he had been carrying, unpaid, for longer than she had known him to exist. Grace reached across the small table, an act of daring that startled her nearly as much as it visibly startled him, and set her hand briefly over his. He did not pull his hand away, though she felt him go very still beneath her touch, the stillness of a man unused to being comforted by anyone, rather than the stillness of a man who wished to be left alone. And after a moment his own hand turned beneath hers, not quite holding it, only acknowledging that it was there, which felt, to Grace, like the largest concession he had made all night. By the time gray light began finding its way through the kitchen window, Julian had laid out, with the same careful precision he applied to his estate ledgers, exactly what he intended to do about the wreckage of that night. He would not return her to the Fenwicks, would instead deliver her himself into his own aunt's household at Thornfield, respectable and unimpeachable, until such time as the rest could be arranged properly and publicly, in a manner that left no room for Pembry's version of events to take root anywhere it mattered. "It is your name I am asking you to risk further," he said, "not mine. Mine is already spent, and I will understand entirely if you would rather I simply saw you safely to whichever door you choose." She did not answer immediately, weighing the shape of what he offered against everything her family had ever taught her to expect from the world, and found the answer had already settled itself somewhere in her chest during that long night. Grace looked at the dog rose still lying between them on the table, and, for the first time since the carriage wheels had turned without her, felt something in her chest unclench toward hope, rather than merely toward survival. The ride to Thornfield the next morning was nothing at all like the one that had brought him to her. Pale, watery sunlight instead of driving rain, his own carriage instead of a borrowed, exhausted horse, and Grace sat across from him with the returned dog rose page now tucked safely back inside her sketchbook, and found herself, despite everything the last day had cost her, unable to stop noticing small, ordinary things, the careful way he had arranged for a hot brick at her feet, the fact that he had thought, somewhere in the wreckage of that night, to have Mrs. Bexley pack her a basket of bread and cheese for the road. He asked her, once, quietly, whether she had slept at all, and when she admitted she had not, he did not press further, only reached across and adjusted the blanket at her feet with an unhurried care that told her more about the whole of his character than any speech could have managed. It was not courtship, precisely, what passed between them in that carriage. It was something quieter and steadier than courtship, the particular ease of two people who had already been tested by worse than a ballroom could offer, and found each other equal to it. Word reached Cross Hall 2 days later, carried by a cousin's letter full of barely concealed relish, that Grace Meredith had not in fact perished quietly of exposure and obscurity as the family had rather hoped, but had instead been personally rescued from a coaching inn by the Duke of Alderley himself, in the middle of a storm, and was now residing under the protection of his own aunt at Thornfield. Lady Fenwick read the letter twice and set it down with a hand that was not entirely steady. Selina, hearing the news secondhand through her mother's stricken face, felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into her stomach. The first true understanding that whatever she had arranged to be rid of her cousin had instead delivered that same cousin directly into the one place in England Selina herself had spent 3 seasons failing to reach. Sir Robert, when he finally emerged from his study to hear the news, said nothing at all for a long moment, only poured himself a large glass of port and drank half of it before observing, to no one in particular, that a debt he had hoped quietly settled now appeared to have grown considerably more complicated and considerably more public than any of them had planned for. The truth, as truths eventually do when a duke has no reason left to guard it, traveled faster than the Fenwick's version of events ever could. Mrs. Bexley, questioned by curious travelers passing back through Farley Cross, told anyone who asked precisely what she had witnessed: a family departing without their own kin, a viscount's ugly persistence, a duke arriving alone through the worst storm of the autumn to set it right, and each retelling lost none of its power for the truth's sake. Even those in the county who had never cared much for gossip found themselves, by the second telling, unable to resist repeating it, because it had, at its center, the two things a good story always required: a genuine villain and a rescue that had actually arrived in time, which was, Mrs. Bexley liked to say afterward, rarer in life than in the novels ladies read by the fire. Julian, for his part, sent a single formal letter to Sir Robert Fenwick, stating plainly that Miss Meredith's welfare was now his family's particular concern, that he trusted no further attempt would be made to involve her in the family's affairs without his own knowledge, and that he looked forward to seeing the matter, and the family, at the Alderley Assembly to be held within the fortnight. The invitation that followed was, Grace understood the moment she read it in his aunt's morning room at Thornfield, not merely an invitation at all, but a summons dressed politely as one, addressed to the Fenwicks by name, requiring their attendance at Alderley Park on an evening when everyone who had ever whispered about a poor relation forgotten at a coaching inn would be gathered under the same roof to see, with their own eyes, precisely how that story actually ended. His aunt, watching the exchange from her chair with the faint, knowing amusement of a woman who had seen a great many young couples navigate exactly this kind of uncertainty, said nothing at all, only poured a second cup of tea and let the two of them work out the rest of it themselves, which Grace suspected was precisely the point. "Are you certain," she asked him, watching his face for any hesitation and finding none, "that you wish the whole county watching when you do whatever it is you mean to do?" "Entirely certain," he said, and there was something in the quiet finality of it that told her the plan he had not yet fully described to her had been decided for some time already. The Alderley Assembly rooms were lit that evening with more candles than Grace had ever seen gathered in one place, every chandelier blazing, and when the Fenwicks arrived, correctly if belatedly, she watched Selina's carefully composed face falter for just an instant at the sight of her cousin standing not near the refreshment table where poor relations traditionally waited to be noticed, but beside the Duke of Alderley's own aunt, dressed in a gown that had clearly been chosen with real care rather than borrowed carelessness. Lady Fenwick's greeting, when it came, was a masterwork of controlled civility that fooled no one in the room who had already heard some version of the coaching-in story, and there were, by that point, very few people left in the county who had not. Grace watched them cross the room with a composure she had spent the last fortnight practicing precisely for this moment, chin level, shoulders even, betraying nothing of the small satisfaction she permitted herself only in the private, unwatched corner of her own mind, and found that vindication, arriving at last, felt quieter and steadier than she had ever imagined it would from the far side of humiliation. Julian crossed the entire length of the assembly room to reach her, exactly as he had done 3 weeks before the storm, except that this time, every eye in the room followed him doing it, and he did not ask her to dance, not yet. He asked her, instead, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear it, and loudly enough that word of it would travel regardless, whether she would do him the very great honor of allowing him to call upon her properly, as a suitor, with every intention of making his regard for her a matter of public record before the season ended. A ripple of murmured conversation moved through the room behind him as he spoke, the particular sound of an entire county revising, in real time, everything it had ever assumed about the plain cousin no one had troubled to introduce properly, and Grace found she could, for the first time in her life, simply let the murmuring happen without flinching from it at all. "I believe," Grace said, watching Selina's face across the room finally crumple into something she no longer troubled to hide, "that the county has already made it a matter of public record for you, my lord." He laughed then, an unguarded, startled sound she suspected very few people in that room had ever heard from him, and led her onto the floor for the first dance, his hands steady at her waist, and if every conversation in the assembly rooms that night turned at some point to the two of them, Grace found she minded it a great deal less than she would once have expected. Across the room, even Mrs. Bexley, who had traveled the whole distance from Farley Cross at the Duke's own invitation, and stood now near the refreshment table in her best grey silk, dabbed once at her eyes with a handkerchief and declared to anyone standing near her that she had known, from the very first night, precisely how the story would end. Selina did not approach her all evening. Lady Fenwick, when their paths crossed near the refreshment table, offered a brittle, hopeful smile that Grace met with nothing crueler than perfect, unreadable politeness, because vindication, she was discovering, required no cruelty of its own to be complete. It required only that the truth finally be permitted to stand where it had always belonged. They married the following spring at Alderley, in a chapel filled with more genuine warmth than either of them had privately expected from a match that had begun, after all, with an abandonment and a storm, and Julian's wedding gift to her was not jewels but a proper leather-bound folio, commissioned from the finest bookbinder in London, to hold every botanical drawing she had ever made and every one she would make afterward, the loved and water-spotted dog rose page mounted carefully as its very first page. Lady Imogen, standing as her closest attendant, whispered that she had known it would end this way since the very letter she sent, and Julian only smiled the rare, unguarded smile that had grown, since that storm, considerably less rare. Mrs. Bexley came up from Farley Cross for the occasion, and cried without any embarrassment at all through the whole ceremony. Grace kept, for the rest of her long and settled life, a small green cloth sketchbook in a drawer at Alderley Park, not because she needed it any longer to hide anything, but because some things, once they have carried you safely through the worst night of your life, are simply worth keeping close for all the nights that come warm and easy afterward.